I was 13 years old when this happened on Halloween night in 2015. Since I had spent the entire day sitting around the house, by 9 p.m., I decided to take a walk in the woods. It was one of my favorite things to do because everything looked so different in the dark, and there was no one else around. I loved the cool night air and the eerie feeling of the forest and the nearby pond. As I started walking past my neighbor's blue house, I noticed they were throwing a huge Halloween party. Flashing lights filled the windows, loud music blasted from inside, and I could hear drunk people shouting in the yard. But soon enough, I left the noise behind and reached the quiet woods, just as I had planned. Walking along the forest trail, I suddenly felt anxious and paranoid. I could barely see where I was going, so I took off my headphones to be more aware of my surroundings. The uneasy feeling faded for a moment as I moved through the trees and reached a street near my house. Turning onto my block, I put my headphones back in and blasted nightcore music, feeling relieved that I was almost home. I started thinking about how silly it was to get so nervous over nothing. But then, a thin figure emerged from behind the still buzzing blue house, and my body tensed up immediately. As the figure got closer, I gripped my house key between my fingers the way I had learned from the internet and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The person was tall, bald, and dressed in a black suit. His face was ghostly white, and with my terrible eyesight for a split second, I almost thought it was Slender Man coming to take me away. But as he got closer, I realized he did have a face. He had painted it to look like a skull. The man was clearly drunk, staggering in a zigzag pattern across the empty street, heading straight for me. For a brief moment, I hoped he was too intoxicated to notice me, but that hope quickly faded when he walked directly toward me. I was completely frozen, in fear. My house was only 2 doors away, but I had to pass this unpredictable man to get there, and I wasn't sure if I could outrun him with my asthma. I started weighing my options. I could turn back and take the long way around, but it was dark, and there was no one around. I wouldn't be able to run that far. Maybe I could go to my grandmother's house? No, there was no guarantee she was even home or awake. As I debated my next move, my thoughts were interrupted when the man placed a hand on my shoulder. He started speaking, but with my music still playing, I couldn't make out his words. All I heard was something about how strange it was for a girl my age to be out alone so late. I just stood there, staring at him. Then he suddenly lifted an arm, pointed toward the woods behind the houses, and said something else. At that moment, I decided that if I didn't act fast, people would find my body in the woods the next morning. I glanced at the forest, then back at the man, shoved him away, and took off sprinting at full speed past him. I cut through the yard of the blue house and ran straight to my front door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to jam my key into the old lock, terrified that at any second, the man would grab me from behind and drag me into the dark woods. Finally, I got inside, making sure the door was locked before I could breathe again. I kicked off my shoes and ran downstairs to the basement, where tears started streaming down my face. Between sobs, I told my brother what had happened, and we called our parents together. They weren't home at the time, but they promised to check on things. We didn't call the police because, being young, we didn't really think it was an option. It was a small town and nothing had actually happened. The next day, my dad told me that the drunk man had just been one of the town's taxi drivers. We never talked about it again. It's been 6 years and I still get extremely anxious going out after dark, even though I no longer live anywhere near that town. I've told this story to my friends a few times, and honestly, it still bothers me that I never got an apology from that guy. I really, really hated that town and the fact that no one there ever did anything when things like this happened. I'm just glad I live somewhere bigger now. where at least we have streetlights. This isn't just one person having a terrifying encounter. It's an entire community living in fear of one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, a ridiculously lush green landscape maintained by a professional service. I vaguely knew that he had lost his temper with the landscapers before, yelling at them outside. I knew he had a short fuse. The first real warning sign that he might be truly unhinged came last summer when he hired a local teenage boy to check on his house once a day while he was away. The boy was supposed to make sure all doors and windows were shut and water the flowers. But then, the instructions became increasingly bizarre. The kid was required to visit multiple times a day, turning specific lights on and off at precise times. He was given strange tasks, forbidden from stepping on the painted lines of the sidewalk, and had to take his dirty shoes off before walking on the concrete. He wasn't allowed to enter the house but had to control the lights from the doorway using a pole with a loop on it. Instead of using a hose to water the lawn, he was ordered to use a tiny watering can. The note left for the boy also implied that the neighbor would be watching and taking pictures if he failed to follow instructions. Eventually, the teen's parents called him and said they were no longer comfortable with the arrangement. They agreed to keep an eye on the house from a distance, but the deal was off. When the neighbor returned from his vacation, he showed up at their house at dawn, waking them up, demanding answers and trying to start a fight. Another neighbor, a retired colonel, came outside to assess the situation and attempted to de-escalate things. The unhinged neighbor then said he would drop the issue only if he were allowed to physically punish the boy. When told that was absolutely out of the question, he lost it. Not long after, another neighbor ran into him at the grocery store. The interaction was deeply unsettling. The man spoke rapidly and non-stop for half an hour, ranting about bizarre things. Among other topics, he stated that wives shouldn't have friends and made crude remarks about another neighbor's sister, claiming she was so overweight she broke the toilet seat during her last visit. Then people started noticing something strange. No one had seen his wife in a long time. Occasionally, she'd step outside to water the flowers, but the moment he appeared, she'd vanish. She had never been especially social, but this was different. That winter, flyers appeared in everyone's mailboxes from the landscaping company he used, along with a note claiming it was mandatory to hire their services or risk legal action. This was, of course, completely false. Our neighborhood consists of standalone homes with no homeowners association. Later, someone caught a glimpse of his wife. Her arm was in a sling, and she had a black eye. When neighbors tried to ask her about it, he intervened before she could speak, claiming she had slipped on the ice. Attempts to speak with her privately all failed. The community even got their church involved and called the police for a welfare check while he was out. But if she was in trouble, she refused help. That year, we had heavy snowfall, and the town's snowplows pushed mounds of snow onto his property. In retaliation, he used a leaf blower to blast snow back into the street, creating a hazardous mess. To stop him, some of us scattered screws on the road outside his house early one morning before the plows arrived. Then came the incident with the dog. One quiet night, a neighbor with a fenced backyard and a new puppy woke up to the sound of the doorbell. When they stepped outside, the crazy neighbor was standing at the edge of the property. He told them that the first time the dog was let out, they'd regret owning it. Then, he pulled out a gun, waved it around, and finally pointed it toward their backyard before saying bang. Understandably, they retreated inside and called the police. When confronted, the man claimed he had just been out for a walk, assumed they were awake, and stopped to chat. He denied pulling his gun, saying it had merely been holstered on his belt. and that he had no intention of threatening anyone. Regardless, he was eventually served some kind of legal notice in the spring. Ever since, he has been sitting outside, writing something in a notebook every time someone walks or drives past his house. We don't know what he's documenting, but I now take an alternate route home just to avoid passing him. Most recently, a neighbor set up a swing set in their backyard. One day they came home from work to find tire tracks in their yard, and the swing set knocked over and crushed. No one saw what happened, but the only vehicle that matched the tire marks was the unhinged neighbor's massive truck. The retired colonel has been collecting statements and keeping records because we all fear this is going to end badly. Studying abroad was going great, and back when I was in my third year of university, my friends and I decided to attend this big Halloween party together. There were 5 of us, all girls aged between 20 and 22. We each dressed in different costumes, had a few drinks beforehand at one of our apartments, then took a taxi into the city center around 11 p.m. to hit the club. When we got there, the music was amazing. Everyone looked fantastic, and aside from the overpriced drinks, we were having an incredible night. Then, out of nowhere, some creep decided to ruin my evening by harassing me everywhere I went. I'm not the type to rudely turn down a drink or a dance if a guy seems nice enough, but this guy, he thought it would be hilarious to stalk me around the club in a terrifying clown costume. And let me tell you, I hate clowns. Seriously, I've been terrified of them since I was a little girl. So, when he came up to me standing way too close and just stared at me through that awful mask, I wasn't amused. I told him to back off, but he just laughed and said, "Oh, come on, love, it's just a joke." I wasn't in the mood. I walked away, went to the bar, and ignored him. But every time I glanced around, I could see him watching me from across the room, still wearing that creepy mask, still staring. He knew it was making me uncomfortable, and that was exactly why he kept doing it. I tried my best to focus on having fun, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Even after a few more drinks, I never felt completely safe that night. At some point, I needed to pee, so I grabbed one of my friends to go with me to the bathroom. She was deep in conversation and reluctant to leave, but I practically dragged her with me. The second we stepped out of the women's restroom, though, she spotted a guy she liked. She told me to wait a minute while she got his number. I really tried to wait for her, but after a while I gave up, went back inside, found a stall, and sent her a text while I was peeing to let her know where I was. By then it was late, almost closing time. The club had emptied out quite a bit, and the restroom wasn't crowded anymore. I stepped out of the stall, went to the sink to wash my hands, and that's when I saw him. The clown. He had just walked into the women's restroom. He still had the mask on. He was still staring. There were no other girls in there, just him and me. And unlike on the dance floor, he wasn't laughing, wasn't pretending to be funny. He was just standing there, watching me. My stomach dropped. He started saying, "Oh, come on, I was just joking. No need to be so uptight." I told him to get the hell out, called him a freak for following me into the bathroom. I was trying to sound tough, trying to act pissed off, but inside, I was terrified. I prayed that someone else would walk in and see what was happening. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long. Soon, a couple of other girls entered and immediately started shouting at him for being in the women's restroom. The noise attracted a security guard who called for backup, and before I knew it, they were dragging him out of the club. The whole situation was surreal. He looked furious at me, as if it was somehow my fault that he was being kicked out. But there was nothing he could do. The bouncers literally dragged him out. What started as a terrifying encounter had a pretty satisfying ending. Finally, I could enjoy the last hour before the club closed without being stalked. But when the night did end, everything turned into chaos. People flooded out of the club, spilling into the streets, crowding into the nearest kebab shops. In the mess of it all, I got separated from my friends, and suddenly, I was alone. I tried to catch a taxi, but every black cab either had its light off or was snatched up before I could even get a word out. It was freezing. It was October, and I was standing there in a short dress and heels, shivering like crazy. Walking home wasn't an option. It would take at least half an hour, and I wasn't about to do that in my condition. I looked around, at the crowd, and my only options were a bunch of random sketchy guys trying to flirt with me. Then I remembered someone. There was this guy I had dated a while back. He lived really close to the club, just a 5-minute walk away. I could call him, crash at his place for the night, but the issue was he might think this meant I still had feelings for him, which I didn't. I hesitated for a long moment, but eventually, I just swallowed my pride and called. He actually answered, said it was fine, told me he'd get me a blanket so I could sleep on his couch. The relief I felt knowing I had a way out of the chaotic mess outside was immense. As I started walking toward his place, though, guilt crept in. My friends, I had no idea where they were. I had texted and called them, but no one had responded. Drunk and stumbling in my heels, I tried to focus on navigating my way to the apartment, while checking my phone for any sign of them, and then I saw him. At first I barely noticed him, a guy slumped on a set of stone steps up ahead. He looked about my age, completely wasted, leaning against the wall like he was totally out of it. Immediately felt uneasy about walking past him alone, so I crossed the street hoping to avoid him altogether. But in my heels, with every loud clack against the pavement, there was no way he didn't hear me. The second he spotted me, he mumbled something drunkenly. I ignored him and kept walking. Then he yelled. I flinched at the sudden outburst. Before I could react, I noticed him glancing over my shoulder at someone else. I turned around and saw another figure standing nearby, half-dressed in some ridiculous costume, holding something in his hands. I squinted in the dim streetlight, trying to make out what it was. Then he raised it to his face, and I realized it was a mask, a clown mask, the same one that had been watching me all night. That wasn't just some random drunk guy I had walked past. It was the clown, and he was not happy to see me. At first I kept walking, hoping he was too drunk to follow me. But the moment I glanced over my shoulder, I knew he had recognized me. He staggered toward me, trying to shove one arm back into his jumpsuit. He was definitely trying to follow me again. My usual instinct was to act tough, so I turned around and yelled at him, telling him that if he came any closer, I would call the police and have him arrested. But instead of backing off, he just laughed. His laugh had been creepy enough in the club, but now, drunk and unhinged, it sounded completely out of control. And hearing it echo from behind that awful plastic mask made my fear spike to a whole new level. I walked as fast as I could in my heels, turning left onto a quieter street that I knew I needed to take. But I didn't want to make it obvious that I was running, so I forced myself to keep a steady pace until I got just far enough ahead. Then, in one quick motion, I yanked off my heels and ran. Barefoot on the freezing wet pavement, I sprinted as fast as I could, praying I'd recognize the apartment building in the darkness. I truly think that was the only thing that saved me. The clown didn't realize I had widened the gap between us until I turned a corner and vanished from his sight. I heard him shout, either in frustration or drunken confusion, but I didn't turn around. I just kept going, desperately searching for the right building. It felt like an eternity, but finally, I spotted it across the street. I bolted toward it, my heart pounding. But just before I reached the buzzer, pain shot through my foot. I screamed, a sharp, involuntary cry of pain, before practically leaping up the remaining steps. I rang his buzzer, and the second the door unlocked, I threw myself inside, nearly collapsing under the weight of my own exhaustion and relief. But the pain was getting worse. I looked down, lifting my foot, and that's when I saw it. Blood dripping from my heel. I hadn't seen what I'd stepped on, but I knew. A shard of broken glass had sliced deep into my foot. Strangely, it didn't hurt at first. Maybe the adrenaline numbed it. But now, even though I could feel it throbbing, my mind was so overwhelmed by relief, knowing I was finally safe, that the pain barely registered. The guy I had called came down to get me. When he saw my foot, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, wrapped my foot in a towel, and drove me straight to A&E. It was 4:30 a.m. when we got there, and the waiting room was packed. A bunch of other drunk people in costumes had injured themselves, making the whole place feel like some kind of weird post-party triage center. And through all of it, through the waiting, the exhaustion, the pain, he stayed with me. He even held my hand when it was finally my turn to be seen. At first I thought they could just stitch me up quickly, but it turned out I had to stay for hours. The doctors wanted to make sure there were no tiny shards of glass left in my foot. Luckily, the first check was clear. They cleaned the wound, stitched me up, and told me I'd be fine, but that I needed to rest for at least 2 weeks. In the end, I went back home to Leeds to recover with my parents. But the whole time I kept texting Joe, the guy who had taken care of me. And when I finally returned, we agreed to give dating another shot. Honestly, after everything he had done for me that night, giving him a second chance felt like the least I could do. And I think that was the moment our relationship really started, when I realized just how much he could support me and care for me in a crisis. I had been so hesitant about any potential relationship with him before, but after that sealed the deal. And now, 8 years later, we're still together. A bit of a weird origin story for a relationship, I know, but in my mind, it makes perfect sense. Running from that clown was the scariest and most unsafe I had ever felt during my university years. Probably the only time I genuinely felt afraid in Sheffield city center. And I will always be grateful to Joe for everything he did for me that night. I just hope he'll keep making me feel safe for many years to come. When I was 30 years old, I had saved up enough money to buy my first house. It wasn't anything special, and to be honest, considering everything, it wasn't in the best neighborhood either. But still, I was proud of the accomplishment. I met all the nearby neighbors, and I have to say, in the first 2 weeks after moving in, I was surprised to find that they all actually seemed pretty nice. A few of them even invited me over for dinner a couple of times. Having lived in various apartments my whole life, this wasn't something I was really used to. Of course, not everyone was like that. 2 houses down from mine, there was a man who was probably in his 50s. After I moved in, every night or so, he would knock on my door at an unreasonable hour asking for things. For example, the first time it happened, he asked if I had any leftover bread I wouldn't be eating. Another time, he asked if I could fill up a bucket of water because his had run out. It was just random things, but understandable. However, I drew the line when he started asking for money. I didn't think I was obligated to constantly meet this guy's needs. I mean, I had just met him after all. His knocking started to become less frequent, but that didn't seem to affect the number of times he showed up quickly before disappearing into the night. A few weeks later, he knocked again. At this point, I was planning to ignore it like I had gotten used to doing, but when I glanced outside, I noticed he looked distressed. Seeing that, I decided the right thing to do was to open the door. So I did. I asked him what he needed, and his answer was not at all what I expected. He asked if I could come over and show him how to use his new grill. Now, this was around midnight. I thought it was an extremely odd time to start grilling, but despite my reservations, I decided to help him. At that point in my life, I actually enjoyed cooking, and I figured spending 10 minutes showing him how to use a grill wouldn't be the end of the world. I told him I'd be over in a minute and that I just needed to put on my shoes. He thanked me and started walking back. A few minutes later, I walked over to his house. I opened the gate and stepped into his backyard. It was dark, so it was hard to see, but it was immediately clear that there was no grill out there. The guy was nowhere to be seen either, even though his back door was wide open. I peeked inside and called out to him. "Yeah, I'm down here. I need your help getting some meat out of the freezer." His muffled voice came from the bottom of the stairs just to my left. I hesitated. There were no lights on down there. In fact, there weren't any lights on in the entire house. I yelled back down, asking if he could turn on a light so I could see. There was silence for a few seconds. Finally, he responded, "No, they're broken. I can't." That's when I knew something was wrong. I shouted back that I thought I should get going. I wasn't joking. As soon as I said that, I heard footsteps racing up the stairs. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in instantly, and I ran straight home, locking the door behind me. I turned back, pulled the curtains, and peeked out one of the windows, but I didn't see anything. I was terrified. I thought about calling the police, but decided against it, thinking I didn't really have any solid proof of what had just happened. For the next few days, I didn't leave my house for anything except work. During those days, I never saw the guy, nor did I hear any late-night knocking. Exactly 1 week after it happened, I was talking to a neighbor across the street. Eventually, the conversation turned to what I had experienced and how I was planning to move because of it. But I was only met with a confused look. That's when I was told that no one had lived in the house I was talking about. It had been abandoned for 2 years. That prompted my neighbor to call the police. However, when they searched the house, they found nothing inside or around it. I moved out a few weeks later, so that's all I know. I'm not sure if anything else ever came from the situation. I still don't know who that man was, or what he was trying to lure me into. It was Halloween night in 2012, my senior year of high school. I went to a Catholic school, so we always had the day off after Halloween since it was considered a church holiday. My friends and I loved getting a head start on our long weekend. On nights we didn't go to parties, we usually did the same things. We'd sit on the front steps of my house for hours joking around. Then we'd walk around the neighborhood and often end up at this terrible pizza place on the other side of town because it was cheap. That night, a few of us had recently gone through breakups, so none of us were in the mood for partying. We stuck to our usual routine. Around 10 or 10:30 p.m., we finished eating, refilled our drinks, and started heading back to my house. To get there, we had to cross the parking lot of a massive shopping center, about the length of 4 football fields, and just as wide. Now, I should mention that we weren't naive kids. We all grew up in the city, had our fair share of urban experiences, and were pretty street smart. We were confident walking that stretch alone. But that night we encountered something we were completely unprepared for. As we walked through the empty parking lot, we suddenly noticed a white tradesman van slowly approaching from behind, about 100 yards away. I know the cliché about old white vans, but I swear this was real. I pointed it out to my friends and we picked up our pace. We pulled up our jacket collars and squared our shoulders to make ourselves look bigger than we actually were. The van immediately sped up and cut us off. The windows were pitch black, so we couldn't see anyone inside. Then a voice called out, not exactly threatening but unsettling, "Hey guys, happy Halloween. You guys like Halloween?" A van doesn't corner you in a parking lot unless someone inside has bad intentions. We had nowhere to go. We could run, but they were in a van. They could easily catch up. Worst of all, we had to turn our backs to them to escape. The voice called out again, "Hey guys, you like Halloween?" I decided to answer, trying to sound tough. "Yeah, we're just heading home." But the guy responded, "Oh no, guys. It's not over yet. We still have tons of candy here." His tone suddenly changed. We still couldn't see anyone inside, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. The three of us stood our ground, bracing ourselves. After a brief silence that felt like an eternity, my friend Aaron broke the tension with a firm, serious tone. "Listen, man, I don't know what you're trying to do, but if you don't leave, there's gonna be a problem." The second he finished speaking, the back doors of the van swung open and two tall men stepped out. They were both wearing black suits, black leather gloves, and cheap Mitt Romney masks. They were built, strong, imposing. But the scariest part was that they weren't laughing. This wasn't some Halloween prank. That was when we knew we were in real danger. The three of us were ready to run, but the van started circling us. We had no idea how to get out of this. I don't know what these guys planned to do with three 18-year-olds, but they seemed prepared, and we were getting ready for the fight of our lives. Then the van stopped. It looked like they were about to make their move. Did I mention there were three of us that night? At that moment, my friend Ryan, who had been silent this whole time, leaned toward us and whispered, "All right, this is a Hail Mary, but get ready to fucking run when I say go." None of us knew what he meant until he casually picked up one of our soda cups. Then, with all his strength, he hurled it straight at the driver's side window. The window was open, and by some miracle it connected perfectly, hitting the driver's head. We took off. We sprinted across the parking lot as fast as we could. The van swerved in the opposite direction, and we ran until we made it back home. Jack and I were confused. How had a simple cup of soda stopped them? Then we found out what really happened. While we were panicking, Ryan had been keeping his cool. Casually, he had poured out his drink and stuffed a big rock into the cup. Then he waited for the right moment. The driver must have thought some kid just threw a soda at him, but instead he got nailed in the head with a rock, possibly knocking him out or at least buying us enough time to get away. It could have been luck. It could have been a guardian angel. Maybe even God himself had a hand in it. I still don't know. But the biggest takeaway from that night: when you're in a bad situation, don't panic. If you lose your head, you lose the fight. This is a true story about my eldest son. At the time, he was in second grade and we were living in Tacoma, Washington. It has been 27 years since this happened, but even now, it still haunts me a little. To set the scene properly, this took place in January of 1995. Up until that point, my son had always walked to and from his bus stop, which was about a block and a half away from our house, at the bottom of a steep hill. Every morning he would walk down, and every afternoon he would walk back up. There was an elderly man from Korea who lived across the street and had been brutally murdered. While this might seem unrelated, needless to say, tensions were already high in our neighborhood. At the time, we lived in a small complex with 4 houses, each with its own fenced yard and a gate enclosing everything. My son usually took a shortcut through an alley behind our home to get to the bus stop. He had done this so many times before that it became routine, and we never had any concerns about his safety until that day. The day started like any other. I woke up around 6 to get the kids ready for school. Our younger son was the first to leave as he was in special education and had to take a bus across town. Then our eldest left. I watched him walk through the complex, out the gate, and disappear into the alley. Fast forward to the afternoon. I knew my son would be home soon. I was busy doing housework when I heard frantic knocking at the door. I opened it to see my next-door neighbor, her face filled with horror. "What's wrong?" I asked. She then told me that she had seen someone trying to lure my son into their car. I immediately screamed for my husband, and the two of us ran. Outside in a panic, a man in a white car had reached out through the driver's side window and grabbed hold of my son's shirt. If you're not a parent, you can't possibly imagine the sheer terror of witnessing something like that. I lost my mind as my husband sprinted toward the car, shouting, "Get the hell away from my son!" Our son was struggling to pull away, while the driver maneuvered the car in a way that prevented him from escaping. Every time my son moved, the car moved to block him. At this point, neighbors across the alley, friends of my husband, heard the commotion and looked over their fence. One of them ran to the front of the car while another pulled our son into his arms and quickly brought him to us. The attacker just sat there in his car, still as a statue, saying nothing. I remember staring into his vacant eyes. I had never seen such emptiness in a person before. It made my skin crawl, like looking into the eyes of pure evil. The man sat there long enough for us to get a full description of his appearance, his car, and his license plate. My next-door neighbor had already called the police, but of course by the time they arrived, the man was gone. To this day, I shudder to think what might have happened to my son if my neighbor hadn't seen what she saw that day. We may never have seen him again. One more thing that unsettled me. Right before the man drove off, he pulled out an old Polaroid camera and took several pictures of my son. That sent chills down my spine. When a police officer finally arrived, he looked like he had just graduated from high school. I remember him eyeing me with skepticism and telling me I was just an overreacting mother. Like, really? That's what you say to someone who just watched their child almost get kidnapped? A word of advice to all police departments. Don't send a rookie to investigate a child abduction case, and don't hire idiots. This incident haunted me for years. For the longest time, I wouldn't let my son out of my sight, and I made him hold my hand everywhere we went. I did everything I could to protect my other children after that. So if you think nothing bad can ever happen to you, think again. Stay vigilant. To end this story on a happy note, my son is now 35 years old, happily married, and a successful auto mechanic with his own shop. God bless you all, and stay safe. This happened to me when I was in 5th grade. I was part of the safety patrol team, and my job was to assist the first grade teacher in making sure the younger kids left safely after school. I usually went to the other side of the school where the library was and waited there with my brother until our parents came to pick us up. To better explain what happened that day, I need to describe how I got to the library from my school. I would exit from the side and walk toward the fence that separated the school from the library. There was a bush with a small gap in it that I often used as a shortcut instead of walking along the fence to the main entrance. By the time I finished helping the teacher, almost everyone had already left the school. I was always the last one to leave since I was the only safety patrol member who didn't get picked up directly from school. As I approached the shortcut, I heard a noise coming from somewhere nearby. Then, almost immediately, a figure appeared. It was a tall, skinny man staring at me with this crazed look in his eyes. He looked extremely disheveled, as if he had just taken a nap inside a dumpster. I felt uneasy because he had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. I started walking faster. Then I heard footsteps rushing toward me. Without looking back, I started running. I reached the bush where the shortcut was and pushed my way through. I got a few scratches in the process, but I didn't stop. When I finally glanced behind me, I saw the crazed man struggling to get through the bushes. Since I was small, it was much easier for me, but he got stuck and was gasping for breath. I took the opportunity to dash into the library. As soon as I got inside, I hid behind my brother, who was on the computer. He was too focused on his screen to notice I was panicking. A few moments later, the man appeared outside the front door and then stepped inside. He started searching through the aisles of books, looking for me. At one point, he turned and locked eyes with me, but quickly noticed my brother was still staring at the computer screen. Then, realizing there were other people in the library, he gave me a hateful glare before walking away. After he left, I told my brother everything, but he didn't believe a word and continued playing on the computer. Looking back, I now realize I should have told someone else, like a librarian or the nearest adult, as soon as it happened. When our parents arrived to pick us up, I told them everything. They were shocked and immediately reported it to the librarian. She picked up the phone and called the police, who arrived shortly after and interviewed me. The next day, I had a meeting with the safety patrol team, and they were all stunned because our school was considered one of the safest in the district. My mother was furious and insisted that from that day forward, a teacher would have to supervise me when I walked to the library. A few days later, I was called into the principal's office during school hours. Some detectives had come to show me surveillance footage from the library. They assured me they were doing everything possible to track down the man. A potential kidnapper lurking on school grounds was something law enforcement couldn't ignore, especially after the news spread and other parents learned about the incident. A few days after that, I was in the library again, waiting for my parents to pick us up. My brother and I were reading magazines when I casually looked up, and my blood ran cold. It was him. I would never forget that face for as long as I lived. This time, however, he looked completely normal and had a young girl with him. She didn't seem scared of him at all, and I assumed she might have been his daughter. After they left, I immediately informed the librarian, who took note of it. I never saw that man again after that day, and we never received any updates from the police. Whoever he was either an evil twin who preyed on children or a man living a double life. One as a loving family man by day and a child predator by night. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and I bought my first home in December 2019 in a quiet and safe neighborhood in West Michigan. I was pleased with my choice, especially since I live alone, aside from my dog, who keeps me company. I have a degree in social work, and my recent internship at the county jail has made me a bit disheartened about local crime and the darker sides of society. I've met quite a few of my neighbors, many of whom are older and generally seem pleasant. But of course, there's always that one odd neighbor who has to make things weird. About a month after I moved in, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I saw a man in his late 50s or early 60s standing there. He introduced himself. We'll call him Richard. Richard had a beard, was a bit on the heavier side, and smelled like cigarettes. Overall, he looked like a fairly normal guy for his age. He told me he lived a few houses down, welcomed me to the neighborhood, and mentioned that he was handy, so if I ever needed anything, I could let him know. I thanked him, thinking it was nice to have someone I could turn to in case of an emergency. Then, he asked if I lived alone. I hesitated for a second before telling him no. It was just me. It struck me as a bit odd that he asked, but I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. As the conversation wrapped up, Richard said, "You know, you're a really beautiful girl. Yeah, very pretty," and smiled at me. I forced a smile back and thanked him, though a chill ran down my spine. After he left, I kept thinking about his comment. If he had been a couple of decades older, maybe it would have come across as a harmless, grandfatherly compliment. But the way he said it just felt off. Months went by, and we would occasionally wave at each other like normal neighbors, but I avoided speaking to him directly until a few weeks ago, nearly a year after our first conversation. I was outside raking leaves in my front yard, and I had tethered my dog, Finn, to a tree so he could enjoy the sunshine and keep an eye on me. Finn is a medium-sized mix, probably part border collie and some kind of shepherd. I adopted him from a local rescue when he was just a puppy. He's incredibly sweet and calm with me, but he can be protective and isn't always friendly toward people he doesn't know. While I was raking, Richard rode over on his lawnmower and started cutting a section of my yard that I hadn't finished yet. I felt a little annoyed because I was trying to learn how to handle fall yard work on my own for the first time, but I didn't let it show and just focused on finishing my own section. Once he was done, he hopped off the mower and walked toward me and Finn. Finn's tail wagged slightly, but his body was tense. He was clearly unsure about Richard. We talked for a few minutes, and I thanked him for the help. Then Richard turned his attention to Finn. He reached his hand out, and Finn sniffed it but let out a low growl. I quietly tried to signal Finn to stop, but then, in what was possibly the dumbest move ever, Richard pretended to slap Finn's face in a playful gesture. Not smart. Finn immediately reacted with a nervous, defensive bark. Embarrassed and not wanting to disturb my neighbors, I tried to calm him down. But then, out of nowhere, this fully grown man dropped to his hands and knees right in front of Finn and started whining like a sad puppy. I just stood there, staring, in disbelief, silently praying that no one else was witnessing this painfully awkward moment. My eyes darted around the surrounding houses, searching for any unfortunate spectators. And sure enough, I locked eyes with a woman peering at us from behind Richard's fence. Eventually, Richard got up from the ground and started telling me about his own dogs. Then he casually mentioned that he still lived with his ex-wife in her basement. He went on and on about their marriage and how it didn't work out because he liked to party while she preferred to stay home. I could only assume that the woman watching us was, in fact, his ex-wife. Before leaving, he told me that he was planning to move away in the spring but would be around through the winter if I needed my driveway shoveled for $50 per job. I told him I'd think about it, though in my head I was thinking $50 seemed pretty steep for a small driveway. I saw him again last week when I was taking out the trash. I noticed him standing in his driveway, staring in my direction. He gave a small wave, but I ignored it, not wanting to invite a conversation. As I turned to walk back to my garage, I suddenly heard him call out, "Hey there!" I had no choice but to turn around and give him a quick nod and wave. Aside from the bizarre puppy whining incident, Richard generally just gives me the creeps. And this morning, my impression of him as a complete weirdo was only reinforced. I was out walking Finn around the neighborhood in the late afternoon. As we made our way past Richard's house, I tried to shovel the snow a little faster, hoping he wouldn't be outside. But of course, he was, just like always. Coincidentally, he always seemed to be outside whenever I was. As I passed his house, he quickly stepped out of his garage and called out to me. Reluctantly, I stopped near his mailbox to acknowledge him. "I broke my wrist," he blurted out. I glanced at his right wrist, which was wrapped in a cast. "Oh no, how did that happen?" I asked. "I don't know," Richard said. I hesitated. How does someone not know how they broke a bone? "I guess I'm just getting old," he added. "I'm probably about the same age as your dad, right?" "Yeah, probably pretty close," I replied. Then he launched into his usual ramblings, talking about things I couldn't care less about. He mentioned his new glasses and how he was in the military, which meant he could get free stuff from the VFW. At one point, he reached out toward Finn again, and I had to remind him that Finn wasn't particularly friendly with people he didn't know well. He then offered to give Finn a bone, but I ignored the idea, not wanting to prolong the conversation. "You know, we're supposed to get some snow this weekend," Richard said glumly. "I heard. About 6 inches or so," I replied, shortly. I absolutely hate small talk, and I'm terrible at pretending to be interested in topics like the weather. "Well, I can clear your driveway if you want," he offered. "I do Marge's. She's in the brown house over there." He pointed. "Across the street." "Oh, right," I said. "You mentioned it was about $50, right?" "Yeah. You know, I kind of misspoke last time we talked about it," he admitted. "We can work something out, maybe $25 or whatever you can afford. I know times are tough with the pandemic and all." He hesitated, then added, "Or, instead, you know, we could just mess around or something." I froze. I stayed silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just suggested. There was no way I had heard him correctly. Or worse, that he had actually meant it the way I thought he did. "Yeah, I'll let you know," I said nervously. "So, do you have a boyfriend?" Richard asked suddenly. "No," I answered automatically, and then immediately regretted it. I should have lied. I'm a terrible liar, and it doesn't come naturally to me. But this was one of those moments where it would have been useful. "Would you want one?" he added. "Not really," I replied, laughing uncomfortably. "Oh, by the way, thanks for waving at me the other day," he said. "That was really nice of you. I was trying to get your attention, but I didn't think you saw me." "Yeah, no problem," I said, wondering why a simple wave had meant so much to him. He started talking about something else, but honestly, I wasn't paying attention anymore. My mind was too focused on deciphering the meaning behind his last few comments. I wrapped up the conversation as quickly as I could, wished him a good day, and started walking away. "So yeah, just let me know about the snow," he called after me. "If you can't pay me in cash, we can just fool around or something. I'll count that instead." Even as he said it, I could hear the smugness in his voice, like he was testing me, pushing boundaries just to see what he could get away with. "Yeah, I don't know about that," I said sarcastically, not turning around as I kept walking. "No big deal," he replied in a strangely cheerful tone. I didn't answer. For the rest of my walk home, I felt my anger building. Angry that I hadn't told him I had a boyfriend. Or better yet, to stay the hell away from me. Angry that he had been so casual and direct, as if there was even the slightest chance that I would actually consider bartering myself for a 40-minute snow shoveling job. Angry that I now felt unsafe, both inside and outside the first home I had worked so hard to buy. Angry that so many young women, and men too, find themselves in situations like this or worse. I'm sure there's more to this story because, knowing him, he'll probably clear my driveway this weekend without me asking, just to have another excuse to talk to me. But for now, I'm just going to sleep with a knife next to my bed. I'm also investing in some curtains for my bedroom windows, the ones that face in his direction, and I really, really hope he still plans on moving in the spring. The neighbor next door was the best you could ever hope for. She worked nights, and on her rare days off, she barely made a sound. Her little dog had been a concern at first, but I soon discovered it was as quiet as she was. I had been in the apartment complex for a year when she told me she had found a boyfriend and that things were going well. After that, I saw her even less than before and was happy to sign another 12-month lease. Everything seemed too good to be true. However, just a month into my second year, things started to change drastically. The apartment next door became filled with loud, frequent arguments, their voices easily heard through the thin walls. Her dog reacted just as badly as I did, barking non-stop while she and her new love screamed at each other. I tried to ignore the noise for a few weeks, but eventually, I lost my patience and started banging on the wall. I was shocked that it worked, but only the first time. Every other attempt was ignored. This nightmare went on for over 3 months. After numerous visits from the police, she eventually came to my door to apologize. She insisted that everything was fine, just like she had said before. But after her boyfriend moved in, his behavior changed. It seemed like all they did was fight. At one point, he may have even hit her. She foolishly forgave him, believing his promise that it would never happen again. But it did. Eventually, she kicked him out, hoping he would move on. However, he soon showed up at her door unexpectedly, begging her to take him back. The police were called and she filed for a restraining order nearly a month ago, hoping he was gone for good. From what I could see and hear, things had returned to how they used to be. I had gone back to living in peace, and I assumed she had, too. Given our opposite schedules, it wasn't unusual for us not to see or hear each other for weeks. I was happy for things to stay that way, until one day something terrible happened. When I got home from work, I drove into the complex and turned into my usual parking spot, only to be stopped by multiple police cars and ambulances. It was surprising to see, but I assumed it wasn't my business. I found another parking spot and headed toward my apartment. As I got closer, I noticed that my neighbor's door was wide open, with officers coming and going. Given what she had told me before, I assumed her ex had shown up uninvited. As I approached our building, a police officer blocked my path and informed me that the area was closed off. I told him I lived in the building and asked what had happened. He couldn't say, but if I waited, a detective might have some questions for me. He spoke into his radio, and a minute later, a man in a suit stepped out of the apartment and pulled me aside. He asked only a few questions. Had I seen anything, heard anything unusual, etc. With each passing second, my anxiety grew, and I pleaded with him to tell me what was going on. He paused and, in a grave tone, told me that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes must have gone wide. I was completely shocked, wondering how I hadn't realized something so significant had happened right next door. Before he could ask another question, I blurted out her ex's name. They were already familiar with him, and from the detective's expression, I could tell he was their prime suspect. He handed me a business card and let me go. I turned to leave but stopped after a few steps. "What about her dog?" I asked. The detective hesitated, and a look of sadness crossed his face. "The attacker killed him too, I'm sorry. I'm not sure why that made me so angry, it just felt so unnecessary. The police probably thought I was crazy," muttering curses under my breath as I walked away. The next morning I was scrolling through the local news online and came across an article about the murder. The story explained that my neighbor had been a week late on rent and had received a notice. When she didn't respond for 2 days, the manager went to check in person. After getting no answer, even after knocking, she let herself in and found the body. The detective was quoted saying they hadn't found the ex-boyfriend yet, but they believed he had fled to his hometown in Lebanon. Since then, not much more information has been released. The ex-boyfriend is still missing and there are no other suspects at this time. I eventually moved to a different apartment complex, but for the remainder of my time there, things returned to normal. 2 months before my lease ended, a new family moved in next door, a young couple with a 5-year-old boy. The noise from their apartment was nonstop. and I was beyond relieved when it was finally time for me to move. Where I live now, the residents are mostly older couples and the noise level is practically non-existent. Even though everything is peaceful now, I don't think I'll ever have a neighbor as good as she was. Whenever I hear a thud on the ceiling or loud voices through the walls, I think back to her and what a wonderful person and neighbor she had been. This happened 9 years ago, but I had just ended a 4-year relationship and moved into an old building in the center of Paris. I had to start over from scratch. I made the mistake of letting my ex keep a lot of my stuff, kitchen utensils, pens, my coffee maker, and so on. At the time, I was working as a waiter, so I could only afford a tiny one-room apartment in a municipal housing block. The building was really old and honestly not very clean, but at least I had a roof over my head. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. But then, I started hearing someone. It was at night, just this low mumbling. I could barely make out the words, but it was something along the lines of, "Go and die." When I looked through the peephole, I saw this thin, shirtless guy grinning at me while scratching the door with his fingers. This became a pattern. Every 2 or 3 nights he would come back muttering threats through the door or singing in a disturbingly childish voice. I considered opening the door to ask what he wanted, but I was afraid he might have a knife or something. I couldn't see his hands through the peephole. What really unsettled me was that during the day, he acted completely normal. Whenever I ran into him, he seemed like any other neighbor, and when I finally confronted him about the nighttime visits, he genuinely looked confused, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. One night I brought home a girl I met at the bar where I worked. For some reason, she left in the middle of the night and I went back to sleep. That was when the mumbling started again, only this time it felt much closer. I opened my eyes to see my neighbor inside my apartment, banging his head against the wall while singing a slow, eerie mix of religious hymns and lullabies. I was completely paralyzed with fear. I tried talking to him, but he just grinned at me. Eventually, he walked out on his own. That was it. I had enough. I called the police. They took him away, and he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Apparently, he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and wasn't supposed to be living there at all. He had escaped from the hospital 2 months earlier. The reason he was institutionalized in the first place? He had randomly attacked a mailman with a shovel, putting the man in a coma. I never saw him again. I moved out 2 years later. My parents had their first child in 1952, and my younger sister Laura was born in early 1958. This story takes place in early 1959. At that time, my father was away on a business trip, and I wouldn't be born until late 1960. So it was just my mother and my infant sister at home, and both of them were very sick with the flu. My mother decided to call my grandmother for help. It was the middle of the night. My mother, father, and sister lived in Manhattan, New York City, while my grandmother lived in Flushing, Queens. My mother called her and asked if she could take a taxi into the city. My grandmother agreed. Not long after the call, my mother heard a strange scratching noise at the front door. She froze. Then, in a small, hesitant voice, she called out, "Mom, is that you? If it is, why aren't you ringing the doorbell?" There was no response, just more scratching. Now my mother was truly frightened. She called out again, "Mom, if that's not you, I'm going to call the police right now." The only response was more scratching against the door. You can imagine how terrified my mother was as she picked up the phone and dialed. I assume that back in the late 1950s there was no 911 yet, just an operator. She said, "Hello, my name is Mrs. Donovan. Someone is scratching at my front door and won't answer when I ask who they are." The operator assured her they would send A police car immediately. The officers arrived quickly. When they checked outside the door, they found an elderly man dressed in pajamas, barefoot in the freezing cold. He was a neighbor who lived on another floor with his 2 daughters. He was suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's and had somehow wandered out of his apartment. The poor man had no ill intentions. He was simply trying to find his way home. Honestly, it's heartbreaking when you think about it. He was incredibly lucky that he happened to scratch at my mother's door. If he had tried any other apartment and no one had heard him, he could have been wandering outside barefoot in single-digit temperatures at 3 in the morning in the middle of winter. The next day, his daughters came down to my mother's apartment. They thanked her for saving their father and apologized profusely for the trouble he had caused.